This is Beyond the Big Screen podcast with your host, Steve Guerra. Thank you for listening to Beyond the Big Screen podcast, where we talk about great movies and stories so great they should be movies. Links to learn more about our guest today can be found in the show notes. You can support Beyond the Big Screen on Patreon.com. By joining on Patreon, you help keep Beyond the Big Screen sustainable and get many great benefits. Go to patreon.com/Beyond the Big Screen to learn more and sign up. Find show notes, links to subscribe, and leave Apple Podcast reviews by going to our website, beyondthebigscreen.com. And now, let's go Beyond the Big Screen.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to a special 4-part series of Eyewitness History that I am doing in collaboration with my friend and fellow Parthenon podcaster, Steve Guerra from Beyond the Big Screen. Hey, Steve, how's it going?
It's great. How are you, Josh? I'm excited to do this series on boxing. It's been one I'd like to have done for a long time, so I'm glad we're into this.
Yeah, no, thanks, Steve. I'm excited as well. Be a cool little experiment. Basically, just so our audience knows what's happening, is you and I are going to do a 4-part little mini series, mini collaboration, basically discussing the intersection between boxing, which our listeners will know means a great deal to me, movies, which means a great deal to you and me as well, and history, which means a great deal, obviously, to both of us.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, so I'm looking forward to it. This will be released on my podcast as 4 separate episodes. And yeah, the first movie that we have is Ali. So the movie Ali, obviously it's a biopic of Muhammad Ali starring Will Smith and Jon Voight, both of whom I believe got nominated for their respective roles as Muhammad Ali and the great Howard Cosell. What did you think of the movie, Steve?
Overall, I like as the kids say today, the whole vibe of the movie. I think it really drew you into the times of Ali, and it had the feeling. It didn't feel like it was new, even though that relatively new movie coming in from the very early 2000s, but it had a 60s-ish, 70s vibe to it. I think it captured that.
Yeah, I agree. They captured the vibe. Vibe is the word to use. They captured it perfectly. And they captured the charisma. I think Will Smith, despite his recent misgivings, to put it mildly, did a phenomenal
pugilism.
His continued commitment to the Ali role. Did a great job embodying Muhammad Ali. As our listeners, and as you know, I'm a huge boxing fanatic. I'm a former state champion. It means a great deal to me. And the problem with that, Steve, is when I watch boxing movies, I tend to be extremely judgy and extremely nitpicky. Ali, I thought, got quite a lot right, certainly from the boxing standpoint. The technique was certainly there. If we just look at the way Will Smith carried out the mechanics of Muhammad Ali and his style, it was perfect, I would say. He was floating around, moving on his toes, keeping his opponent, at the end of his left jab, using his reach. So I think he did that perfectly. The qualms I have is that some of what actually happened to Muhammad Ali was sort of taken out and put into different contexts in the movie. To give a really quick example that is small, and I think nothing hinges on it, but it makes my point. There's a scene right at the weigh-in before his first fight with Sonny Liston, and this will be actually on my birthday, February 25th, 1964 in Miami. Howard Cosell is questioning, at the time, Cassius Clay, and says, "Cassius, now you're being truculent." And then Muhammad Ali, Cassius Clay goes, "Well, if that's good, I'm that." Now, as a matter of fact, what actually happened, that was in pre-fight before Muhammad Ali's his last title defense, 1967, against Zora Foley, where Cosell says, "Well, Cassius, now you're being truculent." And then he says, "Well, whatever truculent means, if it's good, I'm that." So those are some of the small things that if I was prompted to nitpick, I would let rip on. What are your thoughts?
Before we get into that, if we can put a pin into that quickly.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit more about your own boxing career? I knew you were a boxer. I didn't know you were the state champion. You held a belt. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? Fill in the audience on that.
Yeah, more than happy to, if it's of interest to anybody. Well, I found
it is for me at least. So
well, hey, it's just the two of us, right?
Yeah.
I found boxing young. I found boxing when I was 6, 7 years old and instantly took to it. I interviewed someone a while back who made the comment that he was a martial artist, and he said to me, I was great at everything that I did until I did martial arts. And that was when it sort of humbled me. For me, it was the exact opposite. I was bad at everything I did until I found boxing. And then I just sort of took to it, did a bunch of competitions in and around the Minnesota area. And the state champion I won, that would have been, I think, in 2010. And I fought on what's called the smoker circuit. It's going to sound way more tough and it's going to make me look a lot more brave than I really am. But the smoker circuit is basically a circuit of unsanctioned amateur fights. And that basically means that they're not sanctioned by the boxing commission. And whenever I say that, unfailingly, the visual image that people conjure up is something like a fight club.
Yeah.
Right?
Maybe no gloves or
yeah, exactly.
glass on the gloves or something.
Right. And so you're just looking for the plaster of Paris mold in the glove at some point. And it wasn't that. It was basically the same as an amateur fight, as a sanctioned amateur fight. Headgear, mouthpiece, we had a ref keeping everything in order or trying to, as the case is. And yeah, I fought a guy. I did the elimination and I beat out, I think, maybe 8 people for a shot at the state championship belt and beat the guy, John Glaw. That was a unanimous decision. So it was 3 rounds and they did do 10-point must system. Maybe we'll get into that a little bit if it's pertinent for scoring. And yeah, I won 30-27 across the board. And it was great. It was wonderful. I defended it 5 times. And then around that time was when I started to get more and more into Eskrima, Filipino stick fighting. And I won a national championship that same year.
Wow.
Yeah, it wasn't a bad year for martial arts for me. And yeah, I've had a love and a passion for boxing before, during, and certainly since. I've rediscovered, as you know, Steve, I've lost a bunch of weight recently, 60 pounds. And a big part of that was sort of refinding my love and my passion for boxing. And in my discussion with people I've had on the podcast, Barry Tompkins, the great Barry Tompkins, Steve Farhood. I just interviewed Jackie Callan, whose name will undoubtedly be known to some, earlier this week, which was wonderful. It's making me realize just how much I love the sport. And one of the reasons why I was chomping at the bit to find an excuse to talk boxing with you. And if we could cast it in the context of history and it made sense to chat about on the podcast, then I was certainly here for it.
That's a fascinating story right there. So we're talking to the right guy, especially to look at the technicalities of boxing. So overall, you think the technicalities were, if you had to give it a semi-grade, would you give it A, B?
How about let's go out of 5 boxing gloves? How's that?
Okay, out of 5 gloves. How would you rate this movie just overall?
Yeah. Oh, overall, I'd give it 4 out of 5 gloves. And that's if I'm being really, really nitpicky. I thought they got the spirit of the Muhammad Ali story down. I think they did something right, which a lot of movies don't do right. The one I would cite is the movie Chaplin, Robert Downey Jr., 1992. He was nominated. He was phenomenal in it. But Charlie Chaplin was such an amazing, long life. He did so much.
Yeah.
And the problem is the movie tried to capture all of it. Jack of all trades, master of none kind of thing, And with Ali, they were very specific. They catch up with Cassius Clay as he's in training to fight Sonny Liston the first time for the championship. And then it covers him winning it, his stardom. It covers his exile from the boxing world after he refuses to take that step forward to be drafted into the Vietnam War, his comeback. And then it ends with him getting the championship for a second time, 1974, Kinshasa, Zaire, with Big George Foreman.
I wonder what you think. I'm coming into all of this as kind of the noob side of it that I know I watched boxing. I know a little bit about boxing. I've never stepped into the ring or anything, but getting kind of just the feeling of it. Now, if I'm not mistaken, Muhammad Ali, he wasn't a bruiser like a lot of these guys. He was thin and not thin, but he was maybe a little taller and a little lankier, and they seem to catch that. But do you think that Will Smith was maybe just a little too thin and skinny, not beefed up enough?
It's kind of funny. I actually was expecting you to say the opposite, that he was too beefed up.
Oh, interesting.
Well, and so a couple things there. So first off, Cassius Clay was 22 at the time. So he was live and he was only not even a year out. Well, let's see. No, I'll scrap that. Sorry. I was going to mention the Olympics, but that was 1960. So as far as body frame, if anything, I thought Will Smith as Cassius Clay was a little too beefed up. I understand why, because he also had to be Muhammad Ali 1974 with George Foreman, which was 10 years later. And if you look at footage of Cassius Clay versus Muhammad Ali, it's very noticeable that Muhammad Ali is a great deal beefier. Yes, to your point about him not being a bruiser, to put it mildly, he was a dancer. Float like a butterfly, sting like a bee. And his general style, as I think I mentioned, he had a very bizarre style in general in boxing, but extremely bizarre for the heavyweight division, which was he fought tall. And what I mean by that is he fought with his back up and head up. And he was known to lean back from punches, which in boxing typically is a big no-no because you put all your weight on your back foot and you can't retreat the way you should. If the person you're fighting decides to step forward, you have nowhere to go. And that was his style. And he was known for being extremely fast and for being a mover. And later on, we would find out that he also had a phenomenal chin. I mean, the left hook he takes from Joe Frazier when he comes back in their first fight, I don't know how he got up from it, let alone got up by the count of 2. And, for what it's worth, the rest of the boxers in the movie do a great job of replicating the style of their respective fighters. So like Joe Frazier in that movie is played by James Toney, who, funny enough, I interviewed his manager earlier this week. Jackie Callan managed James Toney. James Toney is one of the great defensive fighters over the last 50 years. And he did a great job replicating the Joe Frazier bruising style of coming forward, head movement. And yeah, so the styles were great. Sorry, do you have something? I babbled on for a little bit there.
It is interesting that you bring up that point that this movie, Muhammad Ali has a long career. I think when was his last fight? Was in the early 80s or something? Or
his last fight would have been 1980, the drama in the Bahama with Trevor Berbick.
So, I mean, a long career that starts in the 50s and the 60s. That's a lot of life to capture, especially the more controversial political parts of his career or in his life, which it seems like this movie is the thing that it's more focused on. Steve here. We are a member of the Parthenon Podcast Network, featuring great shows like James Early's Key Battles of American History podcast and many other great shows. Go over to parthenonpodcast.com to learn more. And here is a quick word from our sponsors.
Right. So maybe here we'll pull a bit more of the history aspect in here. So obviously the backdrop here is the Vietnam War, extremely caustic, polarizing issue. The way it worked was Muhammad Ali, leading up to the first Sonny Liston fight, he converted to the Nation of Islam, which is, there's a lot of people could say about the Nation of Islam, but let's keep it simple and call it a separatist movement that laid claim to some version of Islam that wasn't really recognized in mainstream Islamic fundamentalism, led by Elijah Muhammad. After he converts, Elijah Muhammad gives him the name Muhammad Ali. He asks him to renounce his slave name of Cassius Clay and gives him the name Muhammad Ali, which Muhammad meant worthy of all praises and Ali meant most kind. And he was a minister. So he's called up via the Selective Service Act, and he's called up to serve America as an enlisted man in Vietnam. And he stated that he was a conscientious objector because he was a minister for the Nation of Islam. And this was met with a great deal of skepticism. The obvious criticism here is, well, you can't really be a conscientious objector if you're quite literally committing assault for a living.
Yeah, that's
And, that's not an unfair criticism. And there were a lot of people that thought it was a showboat, that it was we would now use the word troll, right? Mm-hmm. But Cassius Clay, Muhammad Ali, was well known for various publicity stunts. I'll leave it to listeners to look up some of the stunts he pulled in his lead up to the fight with Sonny Liston, which included stopping off at Sonny Liston's house at 3 a.m. and waking him up. But yeah, so he gets called and he's asked to report to the office and take the step forward, which constitutes acknowledgement of enlistment into the army. And he refused to take the step, which was a crime. He was arrested there at the office. That part's true. And he also had his title revoked, which, regardless of what someone would think about his religious beliefs, I would just encourage our listeners to think about someone giving up that which they had worked all their life for in the service of a conviction, of a belief. So all that's true. And after all that happens, then the story picks up with him dealing with his 3 years of exile and how he moves forward. Sorry, I feel like I'm monopolizing a little bit.
Oh, no, because I mean, I love hearing this because it fills in so much more of the context and the whole background of this. And that's a big chunk of the movie. One of the big fights that he had, well, one of the fights, maybe not one of the biggest fights, but the fight that I thought was a really interesting fight, and the way that it was filmed and everything made it so fun to watch, was his fight with George Foreman. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about this fight. And, I'm just kind of picking that one out of the air, but that one really stuck with me watching it.
Yeah, so there were a few fighters in boxing.
Did that one have, did that one have a funny name? All the fights seem to have names to them.
Yeah, the Rumble in the Jungle was the one with George Foreman. And it was the coming out party for Don King. That was how Don King became, the Don King as we know him now, unfortunately.
No one loved him.
Yeah, from convicted murderer to boxing promoter, only in America. Right. So George Foreman. So in boxing, there's a number of fighters that are known for their intimidating and terrifying presence. I'll bet the name Mike Tyson just occurred to you.
Sure. Yeah.
And, Sonny Liston, who I've mentioned before, was well known for his intimidating presence. And George Foreman was that. It's a little difficult to remember that now because now we all know him, of course, as the jolly, grill guy. Exactly. That's exactly right. But at the time, this man was terrifying. Okay, so in the fight of the century, Joe Frazier beats Muhammad Ali by, I believe, unanimous decision. Phenomenal fight. It's one of the best fights of all time. And so Joe Frazier beats him, and Muhammad Ali in the interim between these two fights also lost to a guy named Ken Norton. So Ken Norton broke Ali's jaw in the fight and lost. And so George Foreman got the championship by knocking out Joe Frazier. He knocked Joe Frazier out in the second round, and he knocked him down 6 times over the course of 2 rounds. So I kind of want to fix in our listeners' minds what someone who doesn't know what happened, what someone back then obviously would think of a fight leading up to what a fight with Muhammad Ali and George Foreman would look like, given the fact that not only did George Foreman knock out the man that beat him, but also knocked out in the same length of time, also in 2 rounds, Ken Norton in one of his, when Norton challenged for the title. So the man was invincible, basically. And he was known and still is known as one of the greatest punchers, the hardest punchers ever. So that was what they were fighting. And I think the odds makers gave it 8-1 odds to that extent. And also when Ali fought him, he was 32 years old. Now, that may not sound old, and of course it's not, but by boxing standards, that was considered middle-aged. And the fight was, done in Kinshasa, Zaire, under Mobutu Sese Seko, who, just again, to pull on the history portion here, brutal dictator. The stadium where the fight was held had, I think just in the weeks prior, there were a bunch of firing squads that had taken their action in the stadium. So the ground literally had blood soaked into the dirt, to give you an idea.
Why did they have this fight in Kinshasa, Zaire, which I need now is the Democratic Republic of Congo, if I'm not mistaken?
Yes.
Of all places, why did they have this fight in Kinshasa, Zaire, now the Democratic Republic of Congo?
Yeah, well, there were a couple things. So Don King was able to negotiate $5 million for each fighter, which was saying something. And he developed a relationship with, as I said, the dictator Mobutu Sese Seko. Mobutu saw it as a way of generating positive publicity about Zaire, because, if you're reading about Zaire at that time, you're basically reading about the latest massacre and misdeeds. So a decent amount of publicity might go the right way. So that was, in a sentence, the reason why they held it. And it was meant to be a bit of a spectacle. They had a concert, I think it was the day before, that had James Brown in it, B.B. King, bunch of people. It's covered in an amazing documentary, which I think won an Oscar, called When We Were Kings, which I would certainly direct our listeners to. So yeah, that was why they held it in Zaire. Can we talk about the boxing strategy?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Let's talk about that.
Yeah. So it's considered one of the greatest boxing techniques done, because the style would really only work with a style like George Foreman's. So just to tee this up a little bit. So the way Muhammad Ali won the fight was through a technique called the rope-a-dope. Now, that's a phrase that, everyone seems to know.
Yeah, it's a meme now.
Yeah. That's
pretty much.
Yeah, no, it is. It really is. So what it was Muhammad Ali would lay back on ropes, on the boxing ropes, and basically let George Foreman tee off on him. Now, the reason why it would work for someone like George Foreman was George Foreman tended to throw roundhouse punches, wide looping hooks, punches that you could see coming if you're someone like Muhammad Ali, and mount a defense against. I don't know why I'm doing this. Our listeners can't see me, and he trained for it. And the reason why he trained in this particular style, was George Foreman. In the publicity, Ali is talking about how he's going to dance. He's going to dance all night long. He'll go so fast that Foreman won't know what hit him, literally. And in response to that, George Foreman in his training camp is learning how to cut off the ring. Now, cutting off the ring, it's a little difficult to explain without having a visual assist. But basically what you're doing is you're trying to keep your feet on the outside of your opponent's feet. What that does, that means that you're literally a step ahead of the person that you're fighting, right? So if you're moving with the guy and you're staying a step ahead of them, you can close the space moving from left to right. So you can make the ring smaller and smaller and smaller for him until he's in a corner or on the ropes. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And one thing, if I can just interrupt for a second, I think if you look at boxing from the outside, it can just look like two guys clubbing on each other, especially because of even just the mental image you have of these big gloves they have. But it really is the sweet science. There's so much tactics and strategy that goes into this sport.
Yeah, there is. I mean, they call it the sweet science for a reason. The axiom that I've heard 1.5 billion times, it's the art of hitting and not getting hit. And there's a whole physical conversation that's happening between the two fighters. So like when I was fighting, I would always pay very, very close attention to what they were doing with their jab. One guy I fought in particular, when he would just throw a jab, when he only planned on throwing one jab, he would just throw the jab and he would keep his right hand directly on his chin. If he was going to throw a jab and follow up with a right cross or a right hook, he would always drop his right hand as he would start his jab. And if you're, trained to look for that stuff, which I am and was, I was able to mount an offense really quickly. Just meant that when he throw the jab, step to the side, step in, and do what's called an inside left hook. If you're a quicker, which I was a few pounds ago, but I was, known for being kind of the quicker guy. So yeah, that it's absolutely a huge scientific, it's absolutely far more intellectual than people might give it credit for.
If I could interject one more thing.
Absolutely.
One thing that it seemed to me, and I think that this will come up in all of the movies, when you watch real boxing, it's not that the hit that really seems to be the one that has the most impact almost doesn't even seem like anything. Like it'll just look like a little punch and then the person will fall into jelly. And then I think especially where I watched my formative years of being a teenager or even younger than that, watching Mike Tyson do 3 big uppercuts. But those were pretty unusual from what I understand. Oh. It's a couple of I don't even know what the punches are called, jabs, maybe a couple of little punches that just seem, and then you'll see the person will just look like their legs turned into water underneath them.
Yeah. So a couple things. So first, I want to get this out. Yeah, the idea, uppercuts are a bizarre punch, and they're very bizarre to see thrown multiple times in a row. It very rarely happens. Tyson certainly was one of them. One of the things was Tyson was a very short fighter, and what that meant was he could crouch down and come up with an uppercut a lot quicker than someone who might be taller. And also, it's a punch that benefits someone who's fighting close. You're narrowing your distance between you and your opponent.
Those little jabs that don't look like much of anything, and then you see the other fighters just melts basically. Steve here again with a quick word from our sponsors.
Yeah. So on that, it's the punch that you don't see, which is the punch that's going to hurt you. There are the theatrical cinematic punches. I'll reference again, Joe Frazier when he knocked Ali down with that sensational left hook in the 15th round. But there's other shots that you look at it, even if you look at the film, you don't understand really what you're seeing. Like, as we're talking about George Foreman, when George Foreman came back and won the title a second time, and at the time he became the oldest man ever to win the championship. He was 45 years old. The punch that does it for him is he throws against Michael Moorer. He throws sort of a right cross, which I've seen a million different ways, and it never looks like it should hurt Michael Moorer. But Foreman throws a jab, sets it up with the cross, and down he goes. And I watched it a lot, that knockout, because I wanted to figure out what exactly was happening. And I think I finally figured it out. What he's doing is Foreman is pawing his jab out and he's blocking Michael Moorer's vision, right? So he's not seeing what's coming. So then George Foreman takes that right cross and comes right behind and then surprises Moorer. And that's all she wrote.
It's lights out.
Lights out, man. It's to that level of, fighters work in milliseconds. To give you an idea, people don't like starting a combination with a right cross if you're a right-handed fighter. The reason is the right cross has to travel this extra distance across the shoulders, across the chest to reach the opponent. Whereas with the jab, it's all right here at the end. Sorry for babbling on there, but...
Oh, no, I think it really sets us up to these fight scenes of how realistic they are, and to swing back into the history.
Yeah.
One thing that I was wondering about is the real history is that Muhammad Ali was so political, and there's a huge political dimension to like this Rumble in the Jungle. Was Sonny Liston, and in particular with the Rumble in the Jungle, George Foreman, were they political? I mean, in the movie, they kind of feel almost like NPCs in a way.
They were well, let me put it this way. It was politicized in many ways, but what wasn't in the 60s and 70s politicized. So first was Sonny Liston. So Sonny Liston himself was not political in any way. It became politicized because Sonny Liston was a well-known enforcer for the mob, was well-known to have tie-ins with the mafia, which isn't obviously political in and of itself. But when it's contrasted against Cassius Clay and the Nation of Islam, all of a sudden, which themselves have their own record, put it that way, all of a sudden there's this, cloud hanging over the event of what could happen, what might happen, right? And in the second fight, in their rematch, very controversial fight, extremely controversial fight, Ali knocks out, Sonny Liston in the first round with a punch. It was a right cross that, as one boxing writer wrote, couldn't crush a grape, which I agree with. And there were people that thought that Sonny Liston threw the fight. There were people that thought the Nation of Islam threatened him, which could well have happened. And that was the reason why he decided to throw the fight, and the final result of which was chronicled, one of the most famous sports photos ever taken. Ali standing over, Sonny Liston, telling him to get up. No one's going to believe this. Get up. That's on that. It was a bit more politicized than the Rumble in the Jungle. Well, actually, can I talk about Joe Frazier also?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. It was a little bit more politicized when he fought Joe Frazier as well, because they were thrown into these sort of political boxes. Ali was seen as sort of the rebel, the counterculture figure, the hippie, not quite, but, anti-Vietnam in any case, which unfortunately cast Joe Frazier in his undeserved role as sort of the establishment mainstream guy. And Muhammad Ali did a, marketing genius that he played upon this. And so it was politicized that way. And just to give our listeners a very cool tidbit that speaks to how important the fight was, what it meant to America, Frank Sinatra went and obtained a photographer's credit so he could get a press row seat at the fight. And he shot photos of the fight for Life magazine.
Very interesting.
How about that? Yeah.
One fight that they didn't show in this movie, but in the research I stumbled upon it, was one of Ali's last fights. I don't know if it was his last fight. Oh, wait, I'm totally
Larry
blanking.
Holmes. Oh, sorry.
Oh, the Larry Holmes. Oh, what was the name of the fight? The Massacre or something? Or the...
Yeah. So it was his second to last fight. Many people think it was his last fight, and certainly should have been. But so Larry Holmes was Muhammad Ali's sparring partner. He was one of his chief sparring partners, prepping him for the Rumble in the Jungle, in fact. And he had since gone on and become champion. He fought Ken Norton, actually, in a fight that was very good. That's sort of sadly kind of forgotten now. But he won. It was an elimination, I think. I might be wrong, but I think it was. And he beat Ken Norton. And Ali wanted to come back, and he wanted to become the first man. So when he knocked out maybe we should wrap up Rumble in the Jungle quick. When he knocks out George Foreman in the 8th round, he became the second man in history to win the heavyweight championship a second time. The first was Floyd Patterson. And he lost the championship to Leon Spinks later on in Spinks's, I think, 8th fight. Then he came back and beat Leon Spinks on a unanimous decision, became the first man to win the heavyweight championship 3 times. And he retired, decides to come back because he wants to, win the championship a 4th time. And it was horrible. The fight retrospectively should never have been put on, but it certainly should have been stopped. I don't think Ali threw 5 punches the whole fight, and Holmes is literally just teeing off on Ali. And I think Angelo Dundee, Ali's trainer, stopped the fight.
He didn't even really look healthy in that fight.
He had already been diagnosed with Parkinson's, and Jose Torres, who is one of Cus D'Amato's fighters, the guy that trained Floyd Patterson and trained Mike Tyson, said that he was on L-Dopa, which is, I guess, some kind of medicine for Parkinson's. Yeah, no, he wasn't healthy. I guess one of the side effects of the medicine is massive dehydration, which, as you might imagine, isn't ideal for a boxing match.
No, not at all. I guess to start to wind this one down, as far as boxing movies, you picked this one to include in our 4. So yeah. Why does this one make the 4? And maybe what's your overall impression of it as from the boxing perspective?
Yeah. Well, the reason I chose this movie was because I wanted a movie that was based on real events. There's a part of me that thinks it's slightly unfair to look at a fiction, look at Rocky, right? And
which we will do.
Which we will do, by the way.
We're going to come with that. It's going to come some history, though. So.
Yep. But to look at a movie like that and then judge it on the merits, it seems slightly unfair. But like with Ali, I wanted to have a real discussion about the technique, the boxing technique, and how it was done. I love Muhammad Ali. I've studied him more than I've studied probably any other fighter in history. When I was coming up, he was my idol. He really was. And yeah, it seemed that we couldn't quite do the series the way we wanted to and not include Ali. And I give, overall, in terms of the boxing and the way they portrayed the boxing, the way they portrayed the events, it was almost all true with the minor quarrels that I mentioned earlier. So I'm going to take it. I'm going to give this one 5 out of 5 boxing gloves.
Oh, wow. 5 out of 5. I have to agree. I think that it's great history. It's great boxing. It grabs something of a really unique time. I think I have to agree with you that it didn't stretch it out. It didn't. So many movies, people probably throw the hate mail. The Lincoln movie is one example that I'll always bring up. If it had stopped at one point, I think it would have been a wonderful movie. Then they add in a whole other act into it. And it's like, no, you lost it. You turned a really good movie and then made it 3 hours long. And now you've lost me. I think that it ended it at the right point. It didn't have to go all the way to 5 more fights and his death and his, the whole thing. It didn't have to go there, and it didn't. And it made a really tight sports movie.
Yeah.
So what would you say, Josh, by unanimous decision? We love Ali.
Yep. By unanimous decision, I will take Ali.
All right.
Steve, thanks for joining me, man. This was fun, and I look forward to our next episode.
Awesome. And we will see you next time where Josh and I will jump into the ring.
Yeah, exactly.